What is going on, everybody? This is Alex. I'm a PhD candidate at NUS Business School in Singapore, and I welcome you to the fourth episode of the second season of the foresight Chats series. In this season, I'm having conversations with leading experts in futures and foresight and other fields related to futures and foresight. The guest I'm talking to today is really someone whose work I've been looking up to for quite a while and who has positively impacted my own writing and thinking in a number of ways. Today, I'm talking to Gerard Hodgkinson. Gerard P. Hodgkinson is Vice Dean for Research of the Faculty of Humanities and Professor of Strategic Management and Behavioural Science at Alliance Manchester Business School. He is also a registered practitioner occupational psychologist, and over the past 35 years, he has carried out many consultancy assignments with public and private organizations alike. Gerard has co-authored more than 150 scholarly publications in the behavioral sciences, strategic management, and futures and foresight. He currently serves on the editorial board of a number of top journals such as Academy of Management Discoveries, Academy of Management Review, Futures and Foresight Science, Journal of Management, and Strategic Management Journal. Gerard has also been awarded with a number of prestigious awards throughout his career, including the Research Medal by the British Academy of Management. Gerard has written about really fundamental themes in futures and foresight and strategic decision-making more generally. In today's conversation, Gerard and I talk about the role of emotions in foresight and strategic decisions, and about how to take emotions into account. This is relevant when we facilitate foresight interventions in two ways. First, it is relevant as we have to be aware of the emotions of scenario planning participants in a foresight intervention. And second, it is relevant as we have to be aware of our own emotional affective state as facilitators when we conduct foresight interventions. Gerard tells some interesting anecdotes of his foresight practice that led him to the realization of the importance of emotions, but he also explains how to approach this issue with a systematic scholarly framework in mind. Finally, we talk about the philosophical stance to science that underpins all of Gerard's work, critical realism, and about how this is a great way to study foresight because over time it leads us to informed, sophisticated, and multi-layered explanations of how and why foresight works in real life. And as a consequence, it also allows us to design pragmatic interventions to improve our foresight practice. Here I present to you Gerard Hodgkinson. I'm here with Gerard Hodgkinson. Gerard, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's really great to talk to you. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to finally have this conversation with you. You know, I am a big fan of your work. And, you know, I do think that your work is both important and also counterintuitive. And the more interesting thing is perhaps that a lot of practitioners might not be aware of your work. So I hope that this conversation would shed light on a few issues that I think are really important that you wrote about. And there are a lot of stuff that I actually align with, from the importance of emotions in decision-making and scenario planning to critical realism. So I guess that where we started this conversation would probably be irrelevant because everything you wrote about is actually quite important. So perhaps I would start by asking you about one of the things you've been working on more recently, which is the realization that emotions play a very important role in decision making, and perhaps not just in this decision making, but also in the practice of scenario planning and foresight interventions. And also, how do you come to that realization? So perhaps we can start from there.
Okay, so it's actually 20 years ago, shockingly, this year, that I published a case study account of a scenario planning intervention I undertook with my colleague and friend George Wright, who, as you know, edits Futures and Foresight Science. And George and I were contracted by a small to medium enterprise to help the chief executive and her team figure out what was happening in the particular industry sector in which this firm was embedded. She had the realization that technological advances for sure would mean, perhaps in the next 20, 30 years, even in the next 10 years, who knew at the time, that the core offering of this business to business enterprise was going to run out of steam and become an irrelevance. So we were engaged explicitly to really stir things up and ask the awkward questions. The chief executive who hired us was familiar with our work because I'd done a seminar within her business. Actually, they had a series of lunchtime seminars where they invited outside speakers, including from local universities. I was at the University of Leeds at the time, as was George, and we'd both recently joined the university. We were so we went ahead full steam. We contracted carefully what the expectations were, what the deliverables were. And from there on, the entire exercise, as soon as it got underway, really, we became aware that the chief executive, although she'd hired us with a specific remit, was deeply uncomfortable with what we were doing and constantly trying to check in a way that meant we would have been betraying the confidences of the other team members. And a series of bizarre events unfolded, which I've written about extensively with George in the Organisation Studies article we published back in 2002, which is Learning from Failure, which was deliberately titled in a way that had a double meaning. Learning from the failure of the exercise as we'd conceived it, but also learning about the organisation itself and the difficulties it was going through. And without going into all those details now, what happened is the actual exercise was very skillfully sabotaged by the chief executive, while simultaneously she continued to pay us for our services right through to the end of the exercise. We quickly realised we were there for reasons other than the ostensive reasons for which we'd been hired. And it was to do with symbolic mediation. Basically, I think it's the first time in my career I probably came up against a corporate psychopath, an absolute control freak who was detail conscious and micromanaging every movement within the enterprise and our efforts to help the organisation figure out what was happening within the wider sector and broader developments in the world. And there were lots of instances which we documented where sort of intimidation and bullying occurred on a systematic basis. And we realised at root the challenges that the organisation was facing and the individual concerned were deeply emotional in nature, not just cognitive. So I used to believe very firmly that if we develop tools and techniques and implement them skillfully that enable people to think more systematically and effortfully about the situations confronting them, somehow that would lead to rational decisions and the world would be a better place. I think that was a gross oversimplification of basic human psychology. I'm not talking about academic psychology. I'm talking about how people in general and emotions at root lead to many of the cognitive fixations that we've studied in laboratory and field settings over many years as behavioural scientists. And it was that's where the realization came. And that's the moment at which my work began to take an emotional turn, which I've pursued ever since.
Well, first of all, I want to commend you for that article. It's just amazing how you are one of the very few people who dared document this negative case of scenario planning. And I love that article. This story of this recalcitrant CEO is actually quite evocative of experiences I have gone through, and I'm sure other scenario planning practitioners or foresight practitioners in general have gone through. Before delving a bit deeper into the emotions aspect, I'm thinking about a question that I think at this point is relevant. I'm wondering whether the resistance that you have seen in that particular case came from the very beginning, or it came at the point where this manager or her team realized that scenario planning doesn't really give clear-cut predictions about the future. You know what I'm going at with this, right? I think you mentioned this in one of your recent commentaries. It's often the case that the client, surprised of the fact that foresight does not tell you what the future is going to be about, becomes resistant, right? So I want to dig a bit deeper into this element before moving on to emotions.
So I think there's a grain of truth in that, but I think it's also important when we're doing process consultation of a sort that you understand the historical context of the client organization and the struggles they've been dealing with, which we very carefully did. So one of the things I think it's fair to say that was foremost in our mind is that the organization had a deep sense that change was afoot. And they'd had several attempts previously to address these issues head on. So when I gave my lunchtime seminar, I have what I call a song and dance routine, where I set my work out in a broader context, and I just briefly explain why I think it's important we do periodically take stock of our taken for granted assumptions and beliefs, and we expose our mental models into the critical gaze of critical friends, if I can put it like that. And the chief executive drew alongside me very personally over lunch and said, in the last 20 minutes, you've given more insights into this business than 3 of the biggest consulting organizations. We've had them all in, and believe me, what you've just said is so insightful and so remarkable. Will you help us? Now, in hindsight, I should have paused at that point and said, what the hell is going on here? Can I really, little old me, a senior lecturer at the time, still fairly early in my career, only 10 years out, really, could I really have, could that be true? And the alarm bells should have been ringing, but they weren't, of course. And this is where I learned from my own failure. So I allowed my own ego to say, yeah, sure, we can do that. And then I heard myself say, but you really will need broader expertise than just myself. I'm going to bring in a colleague who's more knowledgeable than I am about scenario techniques. And so that's what we did. So there was a history there. And we followed meticulously, actually, Kees van der Heiden's work, which I have a huge regard for. And Scenarios, the Art of Strategic Conversation, was literally not out. It was still in Word files, and we were lucky enough to have possession of the entire manuscript. And with Kees's permission, we used it as the foundation for our intervention, and we used the questions that are in there for eliciting taken for granted assumptions and beliefs. You know, you're familiar with van der Heiden's work. You have a series of questions that really catch people unawares and let them reveal the deeper concerns that are driving their functioning and their strategic behavior. So that's what we did. We asked questions like, if you had the services of a soothsayer and you could look 10 years ahead from now, what would be the 3 questions you'd want to ask? And they write those down and then they share them with you. And then you ask, what would a good answer to each of those 3 questions be? Now, what would be a catastrophic answer to each of those three. And so we proceeded in that way. Then we moved on to doing a kind of business idea diagram, SWOT analysis. We followed it through. But each key step along the way, there was a deep unease. And looking back in hindsight, it began before we even got involved in doing the actual business. The day we went to discuss who should be involved in the workshop and the design of the workshop process, looking back, the CEO was wringing her hands constantly and angsting over who should be invited to this event and who shouldn't, who was in, who was out, what the wider concerns were of external stakeholders that might have what she didn't want to do was tip off wider stakeholders that she was troubled that the business might have a limited future. So this is if we look back now, the way the publishing industry has transformed itself. Many of the things that we would now take for granted, online connectivity, downloadability of books, papers, all that stuff was yet to come, but it was clearly on the horizon. And it's happened now. But at the time it was deep uncertainty, and so you really don't know. That's the definition of nighty and uncertainty. We don't know. Even if we know what we don't know, we still don't know it. That's the point. So we can't know with certainty. We can't forecast. We can't apply quantitative judgment. We might be able to do that to particular elements of the future, but the core root problem is an unknown. It might be a known unknown, but it's still an unknown. And that's where scenario techniques can really come into their own, because they enable us to develop these pen portraits of the future, plausible futures that may or may not unfold in their entirety. But as key elements begin to unfold, we become aware of those elements unfolding, and we're able to quickly adapt the strategy, aware in advance of what we would be otherwise. Now, this has been variously characterized. Some call it peripheral vision, but it's like after this happens, it's like red car syndrome. You know the story. People buy a red car, they suddenly become aware of all the other red cars on the road. As key elements of particular scenarios begin to unfold, they're recognized early. You get this early warning detection. That's what we were trying to do in this exercise. Now, as you say, quite rightly, it did become quickly apparent that no matter which strategic choices this particular organization confronted, none of them was palatable, not one of them. They stood to lose out big time in terms of personal materiality, financial well-being. If you've run a business and your home's on the line, and you can see a scenario unfolding which brings to an end the supremacy of that business, you don't say to the consultant that's the bearer of this message or the enabler of this message coming to light, thank you very much, we'll give you a wedge load more money and you can come back tomorrow and continue this fascinating story. What they will do by hook or by crook is define you as the root cause of the problem. You're damn right there's a problem here and it's you. Why don't you leave? Which is what actually happened in one of our meetings. And then as we sense checked around the room what the rest of the wider team thought, it became apparent they didn't think that. They thought we were doing an invaluable job. So the exercise was allowed to continue, but in a way that meant it was really going through the motions. It was a fascinating experience. So what I'm coming back to the core point of your question, yes, when you're faced with multiple alternatives where none of them look viable for whatever reason, and worse than that, whichever alternative you countenance puts at risk your personal, financial, social, economic, material well-being, possibly even your own physical health, who knows, then rather than make a decision, as we go back to the classic work of Janus and Mann, decision-making, the conflict theory of decision-making would tell us, and this is exactly what we witnessed, what will happen is a series of defense avoidance tactics come in, such as, passing the buck passing. We can't make a decision. We're hamstrung by the board of directors, which include external stakeholders who can't be present for this meeting because if we tip them off, they'll want to close us down prematurely. You see other defense avoidance tactics like that. There are, I think, 16 different tactics of avoidance that can be used, and we pretty well saw all of them in evidence in that case that we documented in the organization studies article.
Thanks for that. And that is why emotions are so relevant. I mean, not just emotion, but cognitive, affective states in general are so relevant when we practice scenarios. So, okay, so let's just perhaps go into the brass tacks of the question for practitioners, right? I guess the question would be, all right, I want to take them into account. How do I engage in emotionally conscious practice, right? How do I prevent those things to happen, right? So that's probably the more practical question.
What this does is to put emotion regulation and self-regulation more generally at the heart of strategic competence. So what does it mean to be a competent strategic leader? Well, we need a framework to help us contextualize all the key elements. And I think one of the best frameworks I've seen around, it's not the only one, but it's one I'm attracted to, is David Tease's notion of managerial dynamic capabilities. So what this entails is 3 essential component processes of sensing, seizing, and transforming. And scenario thinking can help with all 3 of those elements. So let me briefly outline what they are and what I think the psychological challenges are that we need to confront if we're going to be effective in foresight and futures work more generally. So sensing is really the art of gaining and then maintaining strategic situation awareness, both internal and external, to the firm or the enterprise. So what does that mean? It means simply developing a mental model of the situation at hand that is fit for purpose. Notice how I sidestep the thorny philosophical issue of whether reality is socially constructed or real in an objective sense. The mental model we have should be a guidepost that enables us to navigate the uncertainties and the risks that we are confronting. Whether it's completely accurate or not can be a red herring. It just needs to be sufficiently good for purpose, so enough to get us by. And so that's the art of sensing. Now, the problem we have, if you look at studies of mental representations of reality, they're highly resistant to change. They're highly myopic. So sensing is really the art of developing and then maintaining situation awareness, which requires a mental model which is sufficient for purpose. So it has to have enough elements of reality that it serves as a guidepost. And the problem we have is endless studies in cognitive science have shown us when we develop mental representations of reality, because we are boundedly rational, we tend to have gaps, omissions, blind spots, and these mental representations become highly sticky, resistant to change. They lag behind changes in dynamic environments. So environments unfold typically at a quicker pace than our constant need to catch up. And that's partly because we filter reality, we filter out unwanted signals, we use categories, we classify things as being similar when really they're not, and we treat them all the same, although they're not. Stereotypes, judgments of competitors. How we evaluate new threats on the horizon is we typically put them in a box that says safe for now, continue business as usual. So these are all the cognitive devices. Now, of course, what my work shows is that at root, there are emotional reasons why we do this. It isn't simply that we are boundedly rational. We are boundedly rational. There's no question about that. We have limited capacity. That's very easy to demonstrate. But more than that, what holds us to our current position is very often ego protection, ego defense mechanisms that want reality to continue as it is and want reality to not change in a way that cuts to the quick the very things we've worked for throughout our lives. If you're a chief executive of a business that you built from the ground up, the last thing you want is a threatening signal that says, in 10 years from now, everything you're doing today will be wholly irrelevant. We won't have CDs. People will download their music directly. We won't have physical newspapers. People will just read the articles they're interested in online, and they'll be able to do that with a device they carry around in their pockets. These are not welcome messages, and no amount of massaging the message will make that palatable. So we need to go beyond mere thinking, and we need to think about how do we frame and enable cognitive change in a way that takes cognizance of people's emotional states and capabilities. And that's where emotion regulation becomes key. And the same is true when it comes to making strategic choices. So regardless of whether we have a mental model that's fit for purpose, we still have to make choices. And typically what this research shows in the neurosciences and the social cognitive neurosciences is that actually when people are faced with choices, most of the time what they want to do is ground their choices in the present and the past, not the future. It's a pretty scary place. The future is unknown. We don't like uncertainty, really, if we're honest. What we like is security and safety of knowing that all is well with the world. Things that worked in the past give us comfort in the present. Things in the present give us hope for the future. And what we don't want to do is to have to say, you know what, we need to tear up the trees. We're dealing with radical change on the horizon. We need to change radically ahead of and in anticipation of. That's a big ask for most people, and we don't typically do that well. So that's where emotion regulation skills become paramount. And what I mean by that is developing awareness of our own emotional state and the impact that that might be having on our ability to process the information that's in front of us right now on the table. What do we know and what do we not know about the currency of our present strategy? Is it fit for purpose? What do we know objectively about that? What does the evidence in front of us tell us? Now, what do my feelings tell me? If there's a disconnection between what my feelings are telling me right now about the choice we're on and the future as unfolding in the strategic intelligence gathering that we've undertaken, if there's a disconnection between what I feel and what I think about the future, that's an important signal. And that's telling us we need to delve more deeply. We need to think very carefully. Now, equally, if what I'm finding is this new direction we're considering is really exciting me, and I want to just get on with it, I'm becoming impatient, I want change, and yet the evidence in front of me and my colleagues surrounding me are telling me something different, again, we have to ask, is this excitement, this sense of anticipation, eager anticipation, is it misplaced? Am I getting carried away in some kind of journey that's a journey into hell, really, because I'm just not thinking through the options? Or is it that I'm seeing something here that my colleagues are missing? So it comes down to judgment, just as it did before we moved into this hot cognition turn. It all comes down to managerial judgment. Good judgment factors in emotions, but doesn't make emotional choices. That's not what this is about at all. It's about using emotion intelligently alongside other signals. Now, emotion regulation has two elements to it. We need to recognize when our own emotions are impacting negatively on our ability to process information expeditiously, efficaciously. And equally, we need to be aware of the impact of the significant others around us. How are they processing things emotionally? And we do know from a ton of work, which there isn't time to go into, but it's all there in my articles, that broadly speaking, high energy negative emotions will propel people into critical thoughts and reasoning, and people will typically delve deeply, ask the difficult, uncomfortable questions, whereas positive high energy emotions will tend to lead people to action. They'll compel people towards a goal as opposed to avoiding it. So if we think of an approach avoidance kind of, so we need to be cognizant of that. And the art of a good leader is reading the room, reading themselves, and regulating the emotional tempo accordingly. So sometimes we need to upregulate particular types of emotion to inject criticality into a discussion, or to inject positivity into a discussion, to try and balance things off. But equally, not to be driven by the emotions, but to recognize they are having an impact, to ask the awkward questions. Are our feelings leading us to get carried away with success, or to become unduly negative? We can down-regulate emotions. That's the other key side to this skill. So up-regulation, down-regulation. And there are techniques available for doing that, which I've written about and other colleagues have written about. So that's what we're talking about. Now, the third ingredient, or the third component of the David Teese framework that I like. So we've got sensing, strategic situation awareness maintenance,
right.
seizing, making choices that mean we don't fall foul of cognitive biases as best we're able, and we don't become emotionally fixated on the past and the present. Transforming is the third one. So sensing, seizing, transforming. Transforming is really about reconfiguring the organization's assets and resources in such a way that it's able to move with the time. So how do we carry people with us? And that puts center stage identity management. And identity management is really all about asking the question, who are we? What's our sense of collective ownership of the organization? What's our collective journey? How do we need to adjust that identity so that we celebrate the best of the past and present that's relevant to the future, whilst at the same time dispensing with those elements that we are sadly going to have to let go of if we're to move with the times? That's the skillful way to manage identity transitions. You build connections with the past and the present to celebrate what's relevant and can be used to take us forward. And you dispense only with the elements that are no longer necessary. What you don't do is tear up the entire rule book, say to people, everything else that was in the past is now in the past, get with the program or we'll have to let you go. That's not a skillful way to manage these kind of transitions. And what we know now from emerging work in social neuroscience is that when people are faced with those kind of identity threats, the human body mobilizes all its resources at its disposal to protect the ego against those threatening signals. So our mental models don't update in the way that you would think. What we do instead is we very aggressively and actively discount the conflicting information that says we need to change, we need to alter our direction of travel. And instead we mobilize resources that reinforce that sense that everything will be just fine if we carry on as we are. And of course, that's catastrophic when faced with the need for radical change. So transforming is all about how we carry people with us. Now, scenario planning and related techniques are invaluable for all three of those key steps. Sensing, they enable us to question our mental models and revise them. Seizing, they enable us to think more deeply and in a considered way. What is it we're doing? What are the choices that we confront? Which are the best choices given the available evidence? And transforming, they equip us to carry people along the journey by involving them participatively in a meaningful way in the scenario exercises.
Thanks, Gerard. So let me pull some strings here, because what you said really led me to think about a few things, and I want to throw them back at you to see what what you say with that. So I would start from the end. And as you know, I'm also a big fan of managing identity explicitly. I think this started with Van der Heyden, perhaps. The business idea was encompassing organizational identity, although it was more than that. But then it spinned off in other works as well, including Hardin Tibbs, this vision of the future. And what I would perhaps stress and add on what you just said is that I'm also a big fan of explicitly coming up with a plan for managing organizational identity, because it's always, I mean, oftentimes it's an implicit construct, right? But working with it is super useful. So starting from the end of what you said, transforming, right? But going back to the start, your work actually spinned me off into research into meditation and Zen Buddhism. And I guess you know why, because, you know, you mentioned something that is very much related to that, which is being aware of emotions and regulating emotions. So when I started to read on your work, I became more literate on emotions, Western literature of emotions. But on the other hand, being in Asia and being in touch with Asian philosophies, I also started to see that there might be a value in, you know, this practices of mindfulness where you actually are aware of your emotions and emotions of people around you. So there is a connection there that perhaps we need to explore further in the future. And going back to the starting point, another thought I would like to bounce back at you is that this seems to be an implicit assumption in what you said, but I want to bring it out. What you said seems to imply that the management of emotions should take emotions into account as inherent part of decision making. And what I mean by that is that emotions play a part when I decide, right? Now, this seems to be rather straightforward, but just to pull the strings off here for the viewers as well, it is a rather revolutionary claims, because first, with rational choice theories and, you know, rational decision-making theories, emotions were out of the equation completely. And then prospect theory came into being. And, you know, the work, you know better than me, the work by Kahneman and Tversky really pressed home the idea that we have two different systems of reasoning. One is the more rush and emotional and hot and not deliberate, you know, rather intuitive kind of reasoning, and that is fast thinking. And the other is the more logical, cold, deliberate reasoning, that is slow thinking. And that's the name of the book, the popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow, right? But then, just to pull the strings till the end, and then that model was in turn confuted. And that happened in a number of ways. From I remember there was this great article from, I think it was written by Lowenstein, and the article was called Risks as Feeling. And the whole idea is that rather than considering emotions are separate, right? So either you are very emotional or very logical. Actually, the risks as feeling hypothesis says that no, we are considering emotions while we deliberately take decisions, right? So this to me is rather revolutionary, because it completely puts the Kahneman model, the prospect theory, upside down, right? That the two things are not separated. System one, system two are not separated. The emotions are apparent in deliberate thinking, right? So I want to press this point on, and it seems that your work is standing on this important but oftentimes undervalued assumption, right?
You're absolutely right. Thank you for reminding me actually of this element of my work as well. So I have spent quite a lot of time, largely over the last 10 years, thinking about dual process theories of reasoning, judgment, social cognition, as they're known. Dual process theories imply that there are two sets of processes operating. We, as you just elegantly put it, we think fast, we think slow, we think automatically using non-conscious processes, which often don't involve systematically, consciously reasoning through our choices. We go with our gut, is how it's said in the everyday vernacular. Now, the thing is, there are two types of dual process theory. The mainstream kind of cognitive psychology, experimental decision-making literature that Kahneman and Tversky really pioneered with their heuristics and biases work is exemplar. It's the prototypical body of work that's driven what Jonathan Evans describes as default interventionist theories. So we're boundedly rational, we have scarce capacity, so the brain has to have evolved a way of conserving scarce mental resources, so the story goes. And the way it does that is the default position is to minimize the use of effortful cognition. And we do this, the default is system one thinking, as Kahneman would say, or type one processing, which is, or different writers use different nomenclatures, which doesn't help in this area. So type one processing, as I like to call it these days, really is automatic, thinking fast, solutions just pop in your head, go with your gut. You know, this is what we need to do, and we need to do it now, and we need to act fast. That's system one thinking. Of course, the challenge is that within system one thinking or type one thinking, we've got an assortment of things going on. Stereotypes, which can fuel racism, sexism, and every other type of ism. Implicit attitudes, which may actually be irrational implicit attitudes born of superstitious learning, as well as subconscious goals that we're not consciously reflective of, but which nevertheless drive a lot of our behaviors. And then, of course, there's this notion of expert intuition, which is after years of real deep expert judgment and knowledge, we can make snap decisions which are remarkably skillful, but occasionally will get us into hot water and will be leading us into the world of cognitive bias. So the Kahneman position is default intervention. We use as much as possible these automatic, taken for granted, almost routinized ways of making decisions. And we only think hard and systematically when we absolutely have to. And that's why it's called default intervention. The default is we don't intervene mentally. We only intervene when we have to. There's an unusual event. There's something doesn't feel right. The context feels wrong. The situation ahead looks like it's unfolding in a way that demands effort. So if you're driving your car, you can be listening to music, having a conversation with a passenger. You're not aware of changing gears, stopping and starting, adjusting your speed. It just happens. But as soon as the traffic starts to build up or there's an event, you slow down the conversation, or you'll ask the passenger to be quiet for a minute, or you'll turn the radio down and you give it your full conscious attention. That's a good analogy for how we make many decisions. But there's this other class of dual process theory, which Jonathan Evans refers to as parallel competitive theories. And the idea here is that actually type 1, type 2 processes can occur simultaneously. So as I'm talking to you now, I'm effortfully thinking about what I'm going to say next. There's a flow to the conversation as well, though. But at an unconscious level, I'm observing your body language. There are various routinized thoughts that are coming into my head. So it's an assemblage of type 1 and type 2 processes operating in concert in real time. Sometimes the type 1 is driving the bulk of my action. Sometimes it's type 2 processes that are driving the bulk of my action. And when there's a conflict, there has to be a resolution. And we know from social cognitive neuroscience research that typically occurs within working memory, within the prefrontal cortex area, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is a particularly important mechanism. So competitive theories, parallel competitive theories for me, I find far more convincing when we're in the context of managerial and organizational decision making. I just think they're more convincing
Absolutely.
because they give far more cognizance to the role of emotion, not just in type 1 thinking, but also type 2. And they put emotion regulation center stage, or at least they do in the work that I've developed, by the way, I should say, with a number of very generous collaborators. And there are two in particular I want to signal at this point. A lot of my work on intuition has been done very much in collaboration with my dear friend and colleague Eugene Sadler-Smith. And equally, the work on dynamic capabilities and latterly emotion regulation really is joint work with Professor Mark Healey, another dear friend and colleague who happens to be here at Manchester with me these days. And we did work together previously for many years at the University of Leeds as well. And I think I'm much more persuaded by the veracity of the argument that says in real consequential high stakes decision environments, it's a heady mixture of effortful thinking and automated or semi-automated processes that lie for much of our working lives and our social lives beyond conscious awareness, which is where your techniques come in that you mentioned earlier around mindfulness.
Indeed, indeed. Now, I'm glad that you also came to embrace this, as a matter of comparison to our very mundane daily life. I was struck by the idea that when you try to very deliberately and logically compare two job offers or two opportunities, right? And you come up with all reasonable possibilities, thousands of bullet points, and at the end you end up scratching the whole paper because the more objective, right, the more logical choice doesn't feel good, right? That to me is a really interesting example of how the two modes of thinking really blend into each other. There's just no pure system 1 or system 2.
Yeah. I'm absolutely certain of that. And the same is true in the boardroom when you face a very fine decision. And is this a threat or is it an opportunity? Is this going to really derail the whole enterprise, or is this our impetus for the next chapter of a very exciting journey? And when it's a fine cut decision, it's very stressful, to say the least. And very unpleasant. But wise people, I think, learn to manage that unpleasant sensation, which the psychological literature refers to as cognitive dissonance, going right back to the work of Leon Festinger in the late 1950s, of course, which is really at the heart of George Lowenstein's work as well, and my work with Eugene and Mark Healey and so on. I'm a big fan, I should say, of George Lowenstein's work, huge fan.
Indeed.
And the notion of the ostrich effect is exactly the unskilled response to cognitive dissonance, which many people resort to when faced with unpleasant tasks, decision tasks. So we know from George's work that when stock markets start to tumble, investors typically stop looking. And instead they avoid the unpleasant, painful information. And when stock markets are riding high, they're avidly on their apps looking at how the trends are going. And that's the pleasure of information.
And I remember you also mentioned how this can fall back into scenario in a way, because we tend to discard the negative scenarios and tend to prioritize the positive future. This is also.
So, of course, we need to be mindful that negative information, if we do go back to prospect theory, it has been used in the hot cognition world as well. There are papers around now that say negative information, just like losses in prospect theory. So prospect theory, remember, is about gains and losses. If we accentuate one or the other, people exhibit preference reversals, or at least they will dampen down their enthusiasm for an option that they previously thought attractive. But you can also apply this same logic to emotions, and negative emotions typically weigh twice as as large as positive emotions if we follow the same logic of the S-shaped curve. So when we face an unpleasant emotion that tells us this is a very threatening stimulus, we'll pay more attention to that than the opportunity side. And so again, that's quite an important insight.
Indeed, losses loom larger than gains, right?
Losses loom larger than gains, and negative emotions loom larger than positive. So people don't remember the 99 positive endorsements on Facebook when they bring their new book out. They remember the one critical comment that was there that was very acerbic and sarcastic. That's the one that will stick in their head, not the other 99 that said, this is a fantastic read, well done.
Well, there are evolutionary reasons to that, but I guess that will take another full episode into evolutionary psychology. So I want to ask you about how about flipping the coin and thinking about how this impacts not just the clients in a scenario intervention, but also the scenario planning practitioners, right? The foresight practitioners, because you wrote about that. And I remember that when I was reading the commentary, the excellent commentary, by the way, that you wrote in response to my paper with Thomas Chermak, I was literally blown away by your anecdote of the typical foresight practitioner who said that where you were giving a lecture on this topic, he found your comments offensive, right?
Yeah.
And yeah. So I want you to tell us more about that and that particular anecdote and how that informed your idea that the stuff we often teach our clients is the stuff we resist to as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So just to quickly recant the anecdote, it was July 2002, the University of Strathclyde colleagues had put together a 4Sight scenario planning event where many of the world's leading practitioners were present. People like Kees van der Heijden was there. Numerous people who'd gone through Shell, either under his leadership or his predecessors. And many of the world's leading academics who speak into this space were also present. So what I did was what I thought was a fairly uncontroversial keynote speech to set things going on the evening of the 2.5-day event. I think it was a Thursday night or a Friday night, can't remember now anyway, the details don't matter, but I have a 2x2 framework which I developed with my colleagues Neil Anderson and Peter Herriot, two fellow organisational psychologists. And what we talk about is high rigour and high relevance. These days we'd call it high impact and engagement, high academic rigour, and rigour would include methodological and theoretical rigour, and impact and engagement would be about making the world a much better place than it is currently. And within each of the 4 states, we have 4 Ps. There's pedantic science is high rigour but not much engagement with the real world. So that's pedantic, splitting pins into 5 different dimensions. The opposite of that one, of pedantic science, is popularist science, where we jump on a bandwagon and quickly rush to market with ideas that haven't really had the chance to stand the test of time. So very low rigour, but high relevance, very topical and of the moment. And typically those things dissipate very quickly. They become fashions and fads and they fall off the radar, but not always. Occasionally we get sticky practices born of unsound science that just won't dive a death when you want them to. We then have pragmatic science, which is a combination of high rigour and high engagement. And then the last one in the bottom left-hand quadrant is none of the above, what we call puerile science. So it's just useless because it's scientifically poor quality and it's not really engaging with real-world problems anyway. Now, this is not meant to be an exercise where you try and identify topics and put them in one of the 4 boxes. It's about getting us all in our own practices to be self-reflective and ask ourselves, where are we in this space with these ideas, with this body of knowledge that we're working on right now? Are we? And so I thought, I'll stir things up a bit. So what I said was, right at the start of the presentation, I'm going to put this 2x2 up now, and my aim is to nudge people into the top right-hand quadrant.
Of course.
To really think more effortfully, how do we combine the best of academic rigor with the great minds of the practitioners in the room, and move along the science of futures and foresight science, move the science end along in a way that will benefit practice. I didn't think that was controversial. I did make the point that many of our practices are popularist. They're not pragmatic, and they're not drawing on the pedantic science.
You could have said that. You could have said that.
Pragmatic science will draw on the real deep foundations of psychology, sociology, and so on, social and behavioural science writ large. And it will do so to address real world problems. And I said, just the danger is we become so skilled in the art side of this art and science that we lose sight of the science, and we start to evolve practices that may have no foundation. We don't know what works, why it works. Much like your very good article, I was kind of doing that in a more lay way, in a less considered way. Anyway, holy hell broke loose in the discussion. I thought it was going well. People were engaging. They were asking fairly obvious but important questions. And then suddenly this voice from the back of the room piped up. And it was actually what I would call he was actually a very accomplished reflective practitioner. So it was somebody who's a senior academic as well as very accomplished in the world of practice, really had the best of both worlds, but clearly was threatened by this message. And so going back to our earlier conversation, massively impacted on his sense of identity. And he felt for other people in the room and took it on himself to speak for everyone in the room, which is never a good thing to do, and just said, what you've just said is deeply, deeply offensive. You've upset key people in this room. I can tell you that now. You've upset. And he started to name people who hadn't spoken, and who knows whether they were offended or not. That doesn't matter.
Right.
So, of course, what happens then is you start to use all your own emotion regulation skills to the full. So I stood there impassively. I listened to what he had to say. I absorbed it. And then the poor facilitator at the time was a doctoral student, still not fully submitted, who was facilitating the session, who said to me, do you have anything to say in response to this? And I just said, no, I'm not going to engage with it. No, I've got no comment. And then, of course, the rest of the room started to rescue me. So people then would ask really lame, almost silly questions that were of no consequence, given this big, huge emotional shock that's just been, like the grenade's been thrown in, and now people start trying to reply with Roman candles and other fireworks. So I am of no consequence. So, of course, while that was happening, I was gathering my thoughts and retracing my steps very carefully. And then I said, finally, after about 10-minute interlude, I said, listen, I've had time to reflect now, and I would like to respond in a more considered manner to the comments that were just offered. I think it's unfair what you've said. You've mischaracterized the whole purpose of my speech. I started it very carefully by saying we're here to celebrate the very best work of the very best people, including many of the world's leading practitioners. Absolutely no question. So no way did I intend to cause offence. I'm trying to nudge along a conversation. We then made a point of sitting with each other at dinner. And over the next 2 days, it became a ritual. Every single speaker almost that stood up, certainly the more prominent ones, began their own talks by saying they would just like to endorse everything I said, and how much they enjoyed my talk, how much it resonated with their own thinking. So what this taught me in hindsight, 20 plus years later, is that actually we're all victim of the things we study as well. We're all just as prone, even as practitioners, even as reflective practitioners, we're no less immune to emotional capture, that sense of vulnerability, that sense of threat, when our identity as a scholar practitioner or as a practitioner per se comes under attack or even perceived attack, we mobilize whatever resources are at our disposal, psychological or otherwise, and we deploy them to the full. We saw that in the case study I wrote with George Wright, where the chief executive had real power to manipulate the situation. And in a more public forum where an accomplished practitioner felt threatened, what they did was to mobilize their psychological resources, as opposed to psychological resources plus naked power. So this is what it means to be human. We're all, in the end, however powerful we may be in our professional lives or not, we're all exposed to the same vulnerabilities of being human. That's what it means to be human. We're fallible. And that's what makes this whole field of research, behavioural strategy, behavioural insights applied to futures and foresight, techniques and practices. That's what makes it so exciting and so vibrant as a field, and that's why I've devoted my life to it, my professional life at least.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I have to say that in a way, as you said, that anecdote demonstrates that we're all vulnerable to that. But the way you reacted is commendable, as you also demonstrated a way to manage that, right? I mean, certainly, although the two systems of thinking are blended, in that particular moment, you managed to harness to the uttermost of your capabilities system 2 thinking, and you didn't burst in anger against this commentator. So I do commend you for that. So I guess this anecdote doesn't just let us reflect of the fact we are all vulnerable to that, but that we have a way to manage that. We just need to be aware of the situation and just identify it as soon as possible. This is a very good segue to the practitioner/science divide, which is also something that you have been talking about a lot. And in that particular space, I know you, like me, are a proponent of a critical realist approach to science, which you have explained in a number of works. And on the pragmatic side, you are a proponent of design science. So why don't we close up by unpacking a bit this theme? I recall that you are certainly against a rather linear test verify model of science, but I wanted to tell us more about that without me putting words in your mouth. So tell us why critical realism as a framework and design science in particular is so important to make the science, the upcoming science, the budding science of futures and foresight coming along.
Okay. So let me preface this by saying it doesn't mean, if you're a critical realist, that you abhor scientific hypothesis testing. You can still use laboratory, behavioral laboratory techniques. You can use neuroscience. You can use questionnaires. You can do in-field ethnographies. All things are possible. Why I'm attracted to critical realism? There are several you could do a whole broadcast just on this one question: what is critical realism? Why is it so potent? There are several features of this which I like. So to begin with, it really recognizes that reality is both materially real but also socially constructed at the same time. So it eschews in equal measure radical social constructionism, which leads to dead-end relativism, and a form of objectivism, which is naive in the extreme the other way, that says there is an absolute truth, and our job as scientists, as social scientists and behavioural scientists, is to pursue it to the bitter end. Well, if that was so simple, why do we have so few immutable laws? If you take my own field, psychology, very few things would be even approaching that status. We've got cognitive behavioural therapy. We know that works robustly, some of the principles of behaviourism, but there's not much else. I mean, models get overturned. There's so many different theories about the world. So how do we steer this middle ground? It's recognising that we do socially construct things, and then they take on a character and a life of their own. And, you know, somebody in the everyday vernacular said ignorance is bliss. Well, no, ignorance can actually still come around and hurt you very deeply. What you don't know can harm you very seriously. So we create social structures, they're humanly created, and then we reify them. That's the danger. We forget, we lose sight that they were humanly created, but they can become unstoppable as well in some ways. Climate change is a great example where through our social and individual practices, we've basically destroyed the earth. We've changed the physical properties in the environment as a consequence of our human actions. And some of it we can't have back. So for me, critical realism emboldens researchers to think in a more sophisticated way and to blend the material and social and psychological with the physical. And it does that in particular ways. And it recognizes that ontologically, the world is stratified, and we have basic neurobiological and bodily mechanisms at one level of reality. We have cultural, we have material, and so on. And we move between layers and we combine different layers of analysis, and we identify generative mechanisms that connect those different layers of stratified reality in a skillful way. So it's not saying anything goes, just throw in a bit of biology, a bit of culture, a bit of sociology, and Bob's your uncle. That's not critical realism. Critical realism is deeply reflexive and looks for the mechanisms that connect these different layers and account for how individual action can ultimately give rise to wider societal structures, or conversely, wider societal structures can both enable and constrain individual action at the same time. So the agency structure conundrum, it wrestles with like any deep thinking social scientist does. It doesn't de-individualize, neither does it atomize. It kind of deals with that ontological uncertainty. It embraces ontological uncertainty, and given it does that, it also embraces multiple methods, multiple epistemologies that reflect that. And it resists the temptation to look for single root causes of complex, multifaceted phenomena. So why do criminals break into your house and steal your best assets? Well, there are multiple explanations, and they're probably all true, but not true depending on the particular instance in question. So they do it for deprivation reasons, but not everyone who's socially deprived becomes a criminal. Very few people become criminals. Why does this happen? Well, it might be partly psychological. It might be partly to do with economic deprivation, might be to do with lack of education and an inability to then compete effectively in the quote mainstream economy. If you haven't got the credentials, you can't get access to employment in the usual way. There are lots of explanations. That's
interacting with each other very likely.
And they interact with each other and with the situation. So I'm a great believer in person-situation accounts of most things, actually.
And design science as a way to make critical realism practical is fundamental, right?
I think so, yeah. So again, this is my great icon, Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon, of course, is best known for his work on cognitive science and bounded rationality and so on, March and Simon organizations and so on. But he also was influential in his treatise, The Sciences of the Artificial, where he talks about the natural sciences and the artificial sciences. I find that a bit of a false dichotomy, especially when you look at critical realism. So the idea for me of design science is, borrowing from Simon, I claim no originality here. It's about using our scientific resources at our disposal to help make the world better fit for purpose than it is presently. So how can we develop tools, techniques, processes, artifacts, design artifacts that are better fit for purpose than what we have currently at hand? So if we apply this now directly to scenario planning practices, for me, this means how can we take what we know about fundamental social, psychological, and other mechanisms and use those to reimagine some of the tools that we already have developed and use them differently. So to illustrate, let's take the act of facilitating a scenario planning event. In an ideal world, as a facilitator, your dream team that you have to go and facilitate is made up of a group of people of a manageable size, we'll say 7 to 10 participants, and they're all moderately extroverted. So they're not going to dominate the proceedings, but they'll certainly speak their mind when they have to, but they'll be respectful of others. They have to be emotionally stable to the extreme. So they're not going to derail the event by being carried away with their own ego concerns, their own psychological defenses, their own agendas that are unresolved. They have to be open to new experience, naturally inquiring, inquisitive, looking at new ways of thinking, and so on. They have to be agreeable. They get on just fine, but not so agreeable that they can't speak their own mind. Okay. And lastly, conscientious, so that they will play their full part. Now, of course, the reality is, how many chief executives or even middle-level managers have you encountered that fit that description? And how many are more like this? They come in the room, they absolutely fill the room with their presence from the moment they walk through the door till the moment they leave. Pretty well everybody else struggles to get a word in edgeways. If they're lucky to get a word in, it will quickly be swallowed up into this big ego machine. The emotional insecurity is palpable. Anything that threatens their way of thinking, there are two opinions, theirs and the wrong one. They're, conscientious, not really. They kind of breeze in, cause pandemonium, leave. You get in the picture. I'm kind of deliberately characterizing the most obnoxious, unworkable raw material, which is the antithesis of that ideal profile. So what we did, myself and Mark Healey again, we took the literature from personality theory, in particular the 5-factor model of personality, which is a pretty robust psychometric model of the structure of human personality. It's got good cross-cultural underpinnings, it's got good neurobiological mechanisms, and so on. And we said, well, let's take that framework and ask ourselves, what does the ideal participant look like? Now, what does the typical worst-case participant look like? How would we need to adapt the facilitation process to accommodate the worst-case scenario, literally, of people in the room that are going to bombard each other with egos and deep psychological insecurities? And so we reflected on that. And by design science, in this context, what we mean is we take a body of work and we turn it back. So instead of having a hypothesis or a proposition for future theory testing, we turn it around and say, if you want the world to be a better place, apply what we know now in this way, and good things will happen. Right. So that's what we did. So we said, if you're faced with a team where the balance of extroversion and introversion is too strong in the direction of introversion, spend more time building the confidence of the participants through warm-up exercises before you launch full-on into the substantive issues. Otherwise, you'll just be sat round, everybody looking at the floor, not really saying very much. Similarly, if you've got big egos in the room, think about how you're going to enable other people to come into the conversation. Think about how you're going to maybe give that person who loves the sound of their own voice a different kind of role. Take them out, as it were, have them co-facilitate with you or do something else that means other people will be given the opportunity to speak. And then we did, in parallel to that, we looked at the identity literature, coming full circle back to sensing, seizing, transforming. And, you know, we talked about how you try and avoid demographic fault lines or psychological fault lines where you can unwittingly, in a large gathering, all the accountants sit on one table, all the marketers sit on another table, the people from the strategic planning unit are sat on the table over here, and the HR people are sitting over there. What that will do is lead to a disastrous set of scenarios where everybody just myopically creates visions of the future that fit their own thinking. So try and get people involved who've got cross-functional experience, what we call intrapersonal, within person, functional diversity. They're your ideal people who participate in these events, which many chief executives, of course, have. A disaster is everybody on a board comes through the accounting and finance route. And then you've got very limited thinking. So that's kind of how we've applied design thinking so far. And also the use of artifacts, what we call boundary objects, is extremely helpful. Getting people to work on a model or a description of a problem, which of course scenarios themselves are, they're boundary objects. People can play with them, they can manipulate them. And in so doing, traverse functional boundaries and interpersonal boundaries.
So let me see if I get the picture right. I'm trying to pull the strings here also for the viewers that might not be, you know, as familiar as we are with critical realism and all those jargony terms. So on one hand, we have critical realism, which is a philosophy of science, right? A stance towards understanding reality, so to speak, in layman words.
Yeah.
That allows us to understand what are the different causes at different layers of what we see, right? So in a scenario intervention, just to make it clear for those of the listeners who might be practitioners, that would enable us to understand why and how a scenario intervention works at different levels of analysis, so psychological, social, etc. So that's on one hand. And on the other hand, we have design science, which is taking the knowledge obtained with careful and repeated, triangulated, critical realist research, taking that knowledge and apply it pragmatically on our interventions, so that, for example, we are more aware that, you know, given the science we have and the personality profile of the participants in a foresight intervention, we know we might act in certain ways, right? So that's
it. You've nailed it. That's exactly right. And also bringing in sociological understanding. So we'd be cognizant of power relations. So if we brought together a group to work on an exercise, and there are members of the board, there are equally junior people at the early stages of their career, we think about what would those power dynamics do to the exercise? Probably destroy it, in the sense that the junior people are just going to kowtow to. So you would think about, how can we redesign that so that we don't let that happen? We might have to put separate events on, and then we have somebody suitably senior feed back what happened in the event with the junior people that is so insightful that we really need to rethink what we're doing at a more senior level. For example, that would be another design science intervention.
Yeah. Well, Gerard, I think we are out of time. So I would like to thank you for the fantastic conversation. I think it was abundantly clear from our chat that you have impacted positively my thinking, and I hope the viewers can also see that there are ways that we can use science and a more careful approach in understanding emotions as well to improve, to better our scenario planning and foresight interventions in general. I will try my best to paste all the articles we have mentioned in the description box down below this video. I thank you for your time. It was great. And I do wish you all the best with all the other great research that you're doing.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.